Picture yourself standing in a quiet desert at twilight. The sand beneath your feet holds secrets older than empires. Long ago, beneath these ancient Persian lands, something dark and powerful waited in silence. It was not gold or jewels. It was something that would change the world forever. Black liquid gold that nations would kill for. Spies would whisper about it in shadowed rooms. Kings would fall because of it. And one small country would become the chessboard where great powers played their cruelest game. Tonight, let yourself drift back to a time when oil was just being discovered, when Persia was becoming Iran, when democracy tried to bloom in an ancient land, only to be crushed by invisible hands from far away. This is a story of greed and courage, of secret plans and broken promises. It is the story of how a few men in London and Washington decided the fate of millions in Tehran. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let the mystery unfold like smoke from a Persian tea house. Tonight, you will learn how the Middle East was redrawn, not by armies marching in daylight, but by spies moving through shadows. And when you wake tomorrow, you will understand why some wounds never fully heal. Long before anyone dreamed of cars or planes, Persia glowed with holy fire. In temples scattered across ancient hills, flames burned without stopping. Priests in white robes tended these sacred fires, believing they carried messages from heaven. The people called themselves children of light. They worshipped fire as a symbol of truth and purity. They did not know that beneath their feet, deep in the earth, another kind of fire waited. This liquid fire would one day bring strangers from distant lands. It would bring wealth beyond imagining, and sorrow that would last for generations. The land itself was old beyond measure. Mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks touching clouds that had drifted over these same valleys for thousands of years. Rivers carved paths through terrain where civilization first learned to write and keep records. In marketplaces, merchants sold spices that perfumed the air with cinnamon and saffron. Silk traders displayed fabrics that shimmered like captured rainbows. Poets recited verses under pomegranate trees, their words flowing like honey. Life moved at the pace of camel caravans and seasonal rains. Nobody hurried. Time stretched long and patient, like the desert itself. This was a place where history lived in every stone and every breath of wind. But change was coming, though no one could see it yet. In the deep places beneath the sand, pressure had been building for millions of years. Ancient forests had fallen and been buried by shifting earth. Tiny sea creatures had died and settled in layers at the bottom of vanished oceans. Time and weight and heat transformed them slowly into something new, something dark and thick and powerful, something that would burn hotter and longer than any temple flame. The earth kept this secret well, locked away in stone chambers, waiting for the day when curious hands would break the surface and release what had been sleeping there since before humans walked upright. Persian kings built great cities without knowing what lay below their foundations. They raised palaces with gardens that seemed to touch the clouds. Water flowed through channels cut from stone by engineers who understood the science of irrigation. Artists created mosaics that told stories in coloured tiles, each one placed with perfect precision. Scholars studied stars and wrote books about mathematics and medicine that Europe would later translate and claim as their own discoveries. The empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Afghanistan. It was a land of learning and beauty, of poetry and mathematics, but it was also a land that other empires watched with hungry eyes, wondering what treasures might be claimed if the right moment came. When visitors came from the West, they brought gifts and smiles. They spoke of friendship and trade, of cultural exchange and mutual benefit. They admired the carpets and the architecture with what seemed like genuine appreciation. They drank tea in courtyards where fountains whispered secrets to the night air. But some of them were also drawing maps in secret, recording every detail in leather-bound journals. They were measuring distances between cities. They were asking questions about what grew in the soil and what might hide beneath it. They were noting the strength of local armies and the loyalty of tribal leaders. They were the first pieces moving on a chessboard that Persia did not even know existed yet. The game was beginning, though the rules would not be clear for many years to come, and the stakes were higher than anyone could imagine, higher than kingdoms or gold. The Qajar dynasty rose to power when the world was changing fast. They wore tall black hats made of lambskin and elaborate robes embroidered with gold thread. Their portraits showed men with serious faces and long beards, sitting on thrones covered in precious stones that caught the light. But behind the grandeur and ceremony, the empire was fragile as old glass. The Qajars ruled from Tehran, a city nestled against mountains that turned purple and gold at sunset. In the bazaars, merchants still haggled over prices for hand-woven carpets and hammered silver. Life seemed unchanged from centuries before, with the same rhythms of prayer and trade. But cracks were already showing in the foundation that held this ancient empire together. Russia pressed down from the north like winter ice that never melts. Britain pushed up from the south, protecting its precious route to India and all the wealth that flowed from that jewel in the crown. These two giants squeezed Persia between them like fruit in a press, extracting concessions drop by drop. The Qajar Shahs signed treaties they barely understood, written in languages they could not read. They gave away pieces of their country bit by bit, trading sovereignty for loans and empty promises. Russian advisors walked through palace halls with the confidence of owners. British diplomats whispered suggestions in royal ears, making demands sound like friendly advice. Persia was becoming a puppet, though its leaders pretended they still held the strings. Every agreement weakened the country a little more, until sovereignty became just a word on fading documents. Inside the country, people grew restless with each passing year. Religious leaders called for change from their pulpits. Merchants wanted protection from foreign competition that was destroying their livelihoods. Students returning from Europe brought new ideas about rights and constitutions, about governments that answered to the people. In tea houses, men debated late into the night, their voices rising and falling with passion. Should Persia embrace the modern world with all its machinery and ideas, or should it cling to ancient ways that had served for millennia? Could they somehow do both, taking the best of each? The questions hung in the air like smoke from water pipes, never quite settling into answers that satisfied everyone. The old world was dying slowly, but the new one had not yet been born, and the space between felt dangerous and uncertain. Then came whispers of something valuable beneath the ground, something more precious than silk or spices. Foreign geologists arrived with strange equipment, loaded on mules and camels. They hammered metal tubes into the earth and pulled up samples of rock and soil. They tested everything with chemicals and instruments. They made notes in languages the local people could not read, recording findings in code. The visitors said they were looking for minerals, for useful things that might help Persia prosper and join the modern age. But what they really sought was the black gold that their industries desperately needed back home. Their machines were hungry for fuel, and they would travel to the ends of the earth to feed that endless hunger. The Qajar court needed money badly, more desperately, with each passing season. The Shahs had expensive tastes and empty treasuries that echoed with debt. They built palaces while the country crumbled. When a British businessman named William Knox Darcy offered gold for permission to search for oil, the answer came quickly, too quickly. In 1901, a contract was signed that would haunt Iran for generations to come. Darcy received rights to explore and extract oil from almost the entire country, an area larger than many European nations. The agreement lasted 60 years, longer than most lifetimes. In exchange, Persia would get a small percentage of whatever profits might come, if any came at all. Nobody at the court understood what they had truly given away that day. The chessboard was being set up piece by piece, and Persia had just handed control of its most valuable piece to a foreign player who would never, ever give it back. British explorers had been coming to Persia for decades before oil became important to anyone. They arrived as adventurers seeking glory, as diplomats carrying royal letters, as merchants seeking exotic goods to sell back home for handsome profits. They sketched the landscape in careful detail and wrote journals about strange customs that fascinated readers in London. They learned enough Persian to bargain in bazaars and enough local manners to be invited to important homes for elaborate dinners. On the surface, they seemed like curious travellers with innocent intentions. But many of them served another purpose entirely, one they never spoke about in public. They were gathering information piece by careful piece, building a picture of a land that Britain wanted to control without appearing to control it. The reason was simple and ancient as empire itself: geography. Persia sat between British India and the Russian Empire like a buffer zone. It was a no-man's land where the two great powers watched each other with deep suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Britain could not allow Russia to push too far south, or their precious jewel of India would be threatened by invasion. Every mountain pass mattered strategically. Every trade route counted in calculations of power. British agents mapped the terrain with obsessive precision, noting where roads could be built and where armies could march with their supplies. They counted the population in each region and assessed the military strength of local tribes. All of this information flowed back to London, in coded letters and diplomatic pouches that travelled by ship and rail. Then the world began to change, in ways nobody expected or could have predicted. Ships that once ran on coal started using oil instead, and everything shifted. Navies discovered that oil-powered vessels moved faster and travelled farther without needing to stop for fuel. Factories found that oil burned cleaner and hotter than coal, making production more efficient. The British Navy, the most powerful maritime force in the world, realised it needed a reliable supply of this new fuel or face obsolescence. Without it, their empire would slow down while rivals sped past them into the future. This realisation turned oil from an interesting curiosity into a strategic necessity of the highest order. Whoever controlled the oil would control the future of warfare and industry. The race was on. William Knox Darcy was a businessman, not a diplomat or soldier. He had made a fortune in Australian gold mines and was looking for his next big opportunity to multiply his wealth. When geologists told him that Persia might hold vast oil reserves beneath its ancient deserts, he saw his chance for another fortune. He approached the British government for support and encouragement. They helped him quietly, without making official promises that could create diplomatic problems. If he succeeded, Britain would benefit enormously from his private enterprise. If he failed, the government could deny any involvement and walk away clean. It was a perfect arrangement for London, shifting all risk to private hands while keeping all potential rewards for the empire. For Persia, it was a terrible deal that nobody yet understood. Darcy sent engineers and workers into some of the harshest terrain on earth, places where summer heat could kill a strong man in hours. They drilled through rock and sand under a sun that burned skin and dried throats. They fought disease, equipment failures that left them stranded, and supplies that arrived late or not at all. Local tribes sometimes attacked, suspicious of these foreigners and their strange machines that tore into the earth. For 7 long years, Darcy found nothing but dry holes and mounting debts that threatened to ruin him. He nearly gave up 12 times, ready to admit defeat and return to England in shame. But in 1908, in a place called Masjed Soliman, everything changed in an instant. The drill bit punched through a final layer of rock, and oil burst forth in a black fountain that sprayed 50 feet into the air. The workers stood in stunned silence, covered in the dark liquid that soaked their clothes and skin. Then they began to cheer wildly, not knowing they had just opened a wound in the earth that would never heal. The oil that burst from the ground at Masjid Soliman was not just liquid. It was possibility. It was power. It was the future rushing up from the past in one explosive moment. The workers who stood there, drenched and stunned, did not understand what this moment meant for the world. They only knew they had succeeded where everyone expected failure. They had found something precious beneath the Persian desert, something that would make men rich and nations strong. But they could not see the shadows that would follow this black fountain. They could not see the wars and betrayals that would flow from this single point like ripples on water. News of the discovery travelled fast across oceans and borders. In London, celebrations erupted in boardrooms and government offices. The British had secured a source of oil just when their navy needed it most desperately. They would no longer depend on American suppliers or worry about shortages during war. Darcy became a hero overnight, though his fortune was already spent on the 7-year search. The British government quickly moved to take control, forming the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1909. The company's first task was to extract as much oil as possible, as quickly as possible. Persia would receive its small percentage, but Britain would control everything that mattered: the wells, the pipelines, the refineries, the ships that carried the oil away. The oil fields transformed overnight from empty desert into industrial camps. Hundreds of workers arrived from India and Britain to operate the drilling equipment and build facilities. They constructed roads where only camel paths existed before. They brought electricity to places that still lit their homes with oil lamps, though none of that electricity went to Persian homes nearby. The workers lived in separate compounds with their own supplies and rules. Local Persians were hired for the hardest, dirtiest jobs and paid a fraction of what British workers received for easier work. The inequality was visible in every detail, but complaints went nowhere because the company answered only to London. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company grew more powerful with each passing year, becoming almost a government within a government. It controlled vast territories and employed thousands of workers. It built ports and railways to move the oil efficiently. Company officials made deals with local chiefs and tribal leaders, paying them to keep the peace and not ask too many questions. The Persian government received royalty payments, but they were calculated in ways that always favoured the company. When Persia asked to see the accounting books to verify the numbers, they were told the information was proprietary and confidential. "Trust us," the British said, and there was nothing Persia could do but accept whatever was offered. In Tehran, some voices began to question the arrangement. Young, educated Persians who had studied in Europe saw clearly what was happening. Their country sat on an ocean of oil, yet they remained poor while foreigners grew wealthy. The contract Darcy had signed gave Britain control for 60 years, a lifetime of extraction. By the time that contract ended, what would be left? Empty holes in the ground and a few coins in the treasury? These questions circulated in tea houses and university halls. But the Qajar court was too weak and too dependent on British support to challenge anything. The die was cast. The oil flowed west in pipelines that gleamed like silver snakes across the desert, and Persia watched its most valuable resource disappear, drop by precious drop, into ships bound for distant shores. The wound was open now, and it would bleed for decades before anyone found the courage to stop it. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company did not just extract oil from the ground, it extracted power and dignity from an entire nation. By the 1922, the company had become the largest employer in Persia, controlling territories larger than some European countries. Its reach extended into every aspect of life in the oil regions. It decided who worked and who starved. It built towns according to its own plans and enforced its own rules. In these company towns, British employees lived in comfortable houses, with gardens and running water. They had clubs where they gathered to drink tea and play tennis. They had schools for their children and hospitals for their families. Everything was provided. Everything was clean and orderly. Persian workers lived in a different world just across the fence. Their housing consisted of basic barracks without proper ventilation or sanitation. They worked 12-hour shifts in brutal heat for wages that barely fed their families. When they got sick, they had to use overcrowded local clinics, while British workers received care in well-equipped company hospitals. When they tried to form unions or protest conditions, they were fired immediately and blacklisted. Company guards, many of them Indian soldiers hired by the British, enforced the rules with clubs and rifles. The message was clear. This oil, this land, this future belonged to Britain, and Persians were just temporary workers in their own country. The financial arrangements grew more insulting with each passing year. The company calculated its profits in ways that always minimized what Persia received. Expenses were inflated, revenues were hidden in subsidiaries, and accounting was done in London, where nobody from Tehran could verify the numbers. By 1932, Persia was receiving less than £400,000 annually from oil that generated millions for British shareholders. The company paid more in taxes to the British government than in royalties to Persia. This fact, when it finally became known, shocked even those who already suspected they were being cheated. It was not just unfair, it was insulting, a slap in the face to an ancient civilization. Meanwhile, Britain grew stronger on Persian oil. The Royal Navy converted its entire fleet to oil power, giving it speed and range that coal-powered ships could not match. This advantage helped Britain dominate the seas and win wars. British factories hummed with production, fueled by cheap Persian oil. The empire expanded and prospered, while its source of energy remained poor and dependent. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, praised the oil deal as a masterstroke of imperial strategy. He understood that controlling Persian oil meant controlling British destiny, and he did not care what it cost the Persians as long as Britain benefited. In Tehran, resentment built like pressure in a sealed container. Educated Persians read newspapers and understood economics. They saw the numbers and calculated the theft. They watched British officials treat their country like a colony, without even the courtesy of formal colonial status. Persia was technically independent, but independence without control of your own resources is just a different kind of servitude. The anger simmered in universities and government offices. It spread through mosques and marketplaces. People began to ask a dangerous question. What if we took back what was ours? What if we said no to Britain and claimed the oil for ourselves? These were radical ideas in a world where empires still ruled without serious challenge. But radical ideas have a way of growing when conditions are right. And conditions in Persia were becoming more right with each insult, each humiliation, each year of watching foreigners grow rich on national wealth. Change was coming, though nobody yet knew what form it would take or what price would be paid. In 1925, a military officer named Reza Khan seized power and crowned himself Shah of Persia. He took the name Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty that promised to modernize the ancient land. He was a tall man with piercing eyes and a fierce determination to drag his country into the 20th century, whether it wanted to go or not. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. He opened modern schools and universities. He required men to wear Western-style clothing and banned the traditional veil for women. He wanted Persia to look modern, to act modern, to be respected by Europe. But all his reforms ran into one immovable obstacle. Persia did not truly control its own wealth. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company remained untouchable despite the new Shah's reforms. Reza Shah tried to renegotiate the concession, demanding better terms and more transparency. The company refused every significant demand. Behind the scenes, British diplomats made it clear that any serious interference with oil operations would have consequences. Britain might withdraw support for the Shah's government. Britain might even support rivals who would be more cooperative. The threat was never spoken directly, but everyone understood the message. The Shah could reform schools and roads and clothing, but the oil belonged to Britain, and that was not negotiable. Still, Reza Shah pushed as hard as he dared. In 1932, he cancelled the oil concession entirely, declaring it void and demanding complete renegotiation. Britain responded with fury. They sent warships to the Persian Gulf as a show of force. They threatened to blockade Persian ports and strangle trade. They took the case to the League of Nations, making Persia look like the unreasonable party. Reza Shah found himself alone, with no allies willing to challenge Britain over oil. He was forced to back down and accept a new agreement in 1933. The new terms were slightly better, but the company still controlled everything that mattered. The Shah had learned a bitter lesson. You can change many things, but you cannot change the balance of power when you stand alone. The 1,930 seconds brought new dangers from the north and west. Nazi Germany was rising, and Soviet Russia was consolidating power under Stalin. Both empires looked at Persia with strategic interest. Reza Shah tried to play them against each other and against Britain, seeking breathing room for his country. He invited German engineers to help build infrastructure. He bought weapons from multiple sources. He hoped that by balancing these powers, he could maintain some independence. But this strategy was dangerous, like juggling knives in the dark. When World War II erupted in 1939, neutrality became impossible for countries that great powers found strategically important. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Persia simultaneously from south and north. They claimed Reza Shah was too friendly with Germany, and that the Trans-Iranian Railway was needed to supply the Soviet war effort against Hitler. The invasion took only days. Reza Shah's modern army collapsed without serious resistance. The Shah, who had tried so hard to modernize and strengthen his country, was forced to abdicate and go into exile. He died 3 years later in South Africa, bitter and broken. His young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the new Shah at age 21. The young man inherited a throne, but he also inherited his father's gilded cage. He would wear a crown while others held the keys. And, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge, was a politician named Mohammad Mossadegh, who understood exactly what had gone wrong and what needed to be done to fix it. The pieces on the chessboard were moving into position for the greatest game yet. When British and Soviet troops marched into Persia in August 1941, they claimed they came as friends protecting the country from Nazi influence. But the Persians knew invasion when they saw it. Tanks rolled through Tehran streets while the government protested uselessly. The two great powers divided the country between them like cutting a cake. Britain controlled the south and the oil fields, which was what they really cared about. The Soviets took the north, securing their border and preventing any German advance through Persia toward their oil fields in Baku. Persia itself, newly renamed Iran in 1935, had no say in any of this. The war made all pretense of sovereignty disappear like morning mist. The American military soon joined the occupation, though Americans tried to seem less imperial than their allies. They built and operated the Persian Corridor, a supply route that shipped millions of tons of weapons and supplies to help the Soviets fight Germany. American trucks and trains moved day and night through Iranian territory. American soldiers and engineers lived in camps and worked on infrastructure projects. To Iranians, the Americans seemed friendlier than the British or Soviets, less arrogant and more willing to interact as equals. But they were still foreign troops on Iranian soil, another reminder that Iran did not control its own destiny when powerful nations needed something. The war years brought both hardship and awakening. Food grew scarce because armies consumed supplies and disrupted trade. Inflation spiraled as foreign troops spent their money freely. But the occupation also brought contact with new ideas. American soldiers talked about democracy and freedom. Soviet troops spoke of workers' rights and equality. British behaviour showed Iranians what empire looked like, stripped of diplomatic niceties. All of this planted seeds. Young Iranians working for the occupation forces learned technical skills and languages. They saw how modern militaries operated and how powerful countries behaved when they stopped pretending to be polite. These lessons would matter later. In Parliament, politicians debated Iran's future once the war ended. Some wanted to align with Britain and accept that empire was reality. Others looked to the Soviet Union and its promises of supporting nationalism and workers. A third group wanted true independence, refusing to accept that Iran must always be someone's junior partner. This third group found its voice in Mohammad Mossadegh, a wealthy aristocrat who had studied in Europe and understood both Iranian culture and Western politics. He was old now, often sick, and prone to emotional speeches where tears flowed freely. But behind the tears was a sharp mind, an absolute conviction that Iran deserved to control its own resources. When the war ended in 1945, the foreign troops were supposed to leave. The Americans withdrew quickly, having no imperial ambitions in Iran. The British pulled back, but kept their oil operations running as always. The Soviets delayed, trying to establish puppet governments in northern provinces and extract oil concessions. Only American diplomatic pressure finally convinced them to withdraw in 1946. Iran was free again, technically, but the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, as it was now called, remained more powerful than ever. It still controlled the oil. It still paid minimal royalties. It still treated Iranians like guests in their own country. And this, finally, was too much to bear. The chessboard was set, the pieces were in position. In Parliament, Mossadegh stood and began to speak about nationalisation, about taking back what belonged to Iran. The British heard these speeches and began to worry. They did not know yet how far this would go, but they sensed that the game was entering a dangerous new phase where the rules might actually change. Mohammad Mossadegh did not look like a revolutionary. He was 70 years old, thin as a reed, and frequently ill. He often conducted meetings from his bed, wearing pyjamas while discussing affairs of state. He cried easily, his emotions flowing freely in a culture where men were supposed to show strength through stoicism. His opponents mocked him as weak and theatrical, but those who underestimated Mossadegh did not understand that his tears came from genuine feeling, not weakness. He loved Iran with a passion that burned in his chest, and he had spent his entire life preparing for this moment when he could actually do something about the injustice he had witnessed for decades. He came from an aristocratic family with connections to the Qajar dynasty. His mother was a princess. He grew up in privilege, educated in the best schools, but education opened his eyes rather than blinding him with comfort. He studied law in Switzerland and France, learning about constitutions and rights and how nations organized themselves. He saw how European countries treated their own resources and industries. Then he returned home and saw how those same Europeans treated Iran. The contrast burned in his soul. His own country sat on oceans of oil, yet could not build proper schools or hospitals. Why? Because foreigners took the wealth and left only crumbs. Mossadegh entered politics in the 1922nd, serving in various government positions. He opposed Reza Shah's authoritarian methods, but agreed with his desire to modernize. He opposed foreign interference, but understood Iran needed technology and education from abroad. He was not anti-Western. He was pro-Iranian. This distinction mattered, though his enemies would later blur it deliberately. He believed Iran could work with foreign countries as equals, trading fairly and learning from each other. What he could not accept was the colonial relationship where Iran provided resources and received only permission to exist in its own land. By the late 1942, Mossadegh had become the voice of nationalist sentiment in Parliament. He spoke for hours about the oil companies' abuses. He read out the actual numbers, showing how little Iran received compared to what was extracted. He compared Iran's deal with arrangements in other oil-producing countries, showing how uniquely bad Iran's terms were. His speeches spread through the country, printed in newspapers, and discussed in tea houses and mosques. People who had never thought about oil revenues suddenly understood they were being robbed. The company and the British embassy tried to dismiss Mossadegh as an extremist, but his facts were too solid and his passion too real. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, watched all this with mixed feelings. He wanted to be a strong leader like his father, but he had learned caution from his father's fate. He knew the British could make or break him, but he also felt the rising anger of his people. If he sided completely with Britain, he might lose his throne to revolution. If he sided with Mossadegh, Britain might engineer his removal. He tried to walk a middle path, neither fully supporting nor fully opposing the nationalisation movement. This made him look weak to everyone. Mossadegh, meanwhile, drew strength from the people's support. In 1951, Parliament voted overwhelmingly to nationalise the oil industry, and in April of that year, Mossadegh became Prime Minister, with a mandate to make nationalisation real. The chess game had just become far more interesting, and Britain was no longer sure it could win. On the 15th of March 1951, the Iranian Parliament voted to nationalise the oil industry. The chamber erupted in celebration, members embracing each other and shouting with joy. Mossadegh wept openly, his thin shoulders shaking with emotion. For the first time in 50 years, Iran had claimed sovereignty over its own most valuable resource. The law stated simply that all oil operations would come under control of a new national Iranian oil company. The Anglo-Iranian oil company would no longer exist in Iran. Its facilities, its pipelines, its refineries would all become Iranian property. Compensation would be paid based on fair valuations, but control would transfer immediately. It seemed like a miracle, like David defeating Goliath with nothing but righteous anger and democratic process. In London, the reaction was shock followed quickly by rage. The British government and the oil company saw nationalisation as theft, pure and simple. They had invested millions in finding and extracting the oil. They had built the entire infrastructure from nothing. The fact that they had made billions in profit while Iran starved did not enter their calculations. Property rights were sacred, they declared. International law protected investments. This nationalisation was illegal, they insisted, though Iran pointed out that nations have every right to control resources within their own borders. The British did not care about legal arguments. They cared about power and money, and the precedent this would set. If Iran got away with nationalisation, every oil-producing country might try the same thing. The company pulled out its British employees immediately, trying to cripple operations. Thousands of technicians and managers left on ships, taking their expertise with them. The company believed Iranians could not possibly run the complex operations alone, but the Iranians surprised everyone. Engineers and workers who had been denied promotions suddenly stepped up. They kept the wells pumping and the refineries operating. Production dropped initially, but it did not stop. Iran proved it could manage its own resources if given the chance. This made the British even angrier because it demolished their excuse that nationalisation would lead to disaster and chaos. Britain then implemented an international boycott. They used their naval power to threaten any ships that tried to carry Iranian oil. They pressured other countries not to buy from Iran. They froze Iranian assets in British banks, They took the case to international courts, tying up Iranian oil sales in endless legal battles. The boycott was designed to strangle Iran economically, to make nationalization so painful that Iranians would beg for the company to return. And slowly, painfully, the strategy began to work. Iranian oil sat in storage tanks with nowhere to go. Government revenues collapsed. The treasury emptied. Mossadegh tried to find buyers, but few countries dared defy Britain. Even those sympathetic to Iran's cause feared British retaliation. Inside Iran, divisions appeared. Wealthy landowners and merchants who depended on British trade grew nervous. Religious conservatives worried about economic collapse and social instability. The Shah watched his country struggle and wondered if Mossadegh had gone too far. Only the common people remained solidly behind the Prime Minister, believing that short-term pain was worth long-term dignity. But bread and dignity cannot both be eaten when stomachs are empty. Mossadegh faced an impossible situation. He had won the legal battle, but was losing the economic war. And in London and Washington, men in quiet offices were already planning something far more sinister than boycotts. They were planning to remove Mossadegh entirely, to prove that some countries could never truly be independent, no matter what votes they won or laws they passed. Winston Churchill returned as British Prime Minister in October 1951, and he saw the Iran situation as a test of British will. Churchill had built his career on empire. He believed in Britain's right to rule and guide lesser nations. The idea that Iran could simply take British property offended everything he stood for. He demanded action, not negotiations. He wanted Mossadegh removed and a compliant government installed, but Britain alone could no longer impose its will as easily as in the old days. The empire was weakening, exhausted by 2 world wars. Churchill needed American help, and the Americans were not initially interested in Britain's oil problems. President Harry Truman sympathized with Iranian nationalism. He understood that people wanted to control their own resources. America had itself thrown off British rule in 1776 for similar reasons. Truman also knew that heavy-handed imperialism pushed countries toward communism. If the West crushed Iran's democratic government for nationalizing oil, Iranians might turn to the Soviet Union out of desperation. Truman refused Churchill's requests to join in toppling Mossadegh. He encouraged negotiations instead, hoping Britain and Iran could find a compromise where Iran kept control, but Britain maintained access to oil at fair prices. These negotiations went nowhere, because neither side trusted the other enough to make real concessions. Then in January 1953, Dwight Eisenhower became president, and everything changed. Eisenhower's administration viewed the world through the lens of the Cold War. Every conflict became a test of strength against Soviet communism. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, who ran the CIA, saw threats everywhere. They believed in using covert action to protect American interests, toppling unfriendly governments before they could ally with Moscow. When British intelligence approached them with warnings that Mossadegh might turn to the Soviets, the Americans finally listened. The warning was exaggerated, almost certainly false, but it worked on American fears. Mossadegh was not a communist. He had actually outlawed the Communist Tudeh Party when they challenged his authority. But he was desperate for allies, as the boycott destroyed Iran's economy. He made some statements about possibly accepting Soviet aid if the West continued its economic warfare. These statements, taken out of context and amplified by British propaganda, painted Mossadegh as a Soviet sympathizer. American intelligence officers, who should have known better, chose to believe the worst. They convinced themselves that Iran was about to fall to communism, that Mossadegh was either a fool or a secret communist who would deliver Iran to Moscow. None of this was true, but truth mattered less than perception and fear. The Dulles brothers brought a proposal to Eisenhower, a covert operation to remove Mossadegh and restore full power to the Shah, who would be grateful and cooperative. It would be quick, cheap, and deniable. If it succeeded, Iran would remain in the Western camp, and oil would flow again. If it failed, America could deny involvement. Eisenhower had doubts, but ultimately approved. He worried about communist expansion more than he cared about Iranian democracy. The operation received a code name, Ajax. British intelligence called their part Operation Boot. Together, MI6 and the CIA would attempt something that had never been done before, using covert action to topple the democratically elected government of a friendly nation during peacetime. The decision was made in quiet offices far from Iran. The Iranians who would suffer and die had no voice in the decision. Their democracy, their choice, their future were now just pieces on a chessboard where great powers played their games. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, and he carried his family's sense of destiny. He worked for the CIA's Middle East Division, and he would lead Operation Ajax on the ground in Iran. In March 1953, he travelled to Cyprus and Beirut to meet with British intelligence officers and plan the coup. They gathered in hotel rooms and safe houses, spreading maps across tables and discussing which Iranian generals might be bribed, which newspapers could be bought, which mullahs would accept money to denounce Mossadegh from their pulpits. It was methodical work, like planning a complex business merger, except the product was the overthrow of a sovereign government. The British brought experience and connections built over decades. They knew which tribal leaders resented Mossadegh for threatening their privileges. They knew which politicians could be bought and which military officers felt passed over for promotion. The CIA brought money, vast amounts compared to what MI6 could provide. American dollars flowed into special accounts, ready to be spent on bribes, propaganda, and hired mobs. The planners estimated they would need several $1 million, a fortune in 1953, but a bargain compared to military intervention. They would buy a country's future with cash and clever manipulation, proving that modern imperialism did not need armies if spies were cunning enough. The plan had several phases. First, create chaos and make Iranians lose faith in Mossadegh's government. This meant paying newspapers to print lies, hiring thugs to attack property while pretending to be Mossadegh supporters, and bribing religious leaders to issue statements condemning the Prime Minister. Second, convince the Shah to sign decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a new Prime Minister. The Shah was reluctant and frightened, but the plotters believed they could steal his courage. Third, use military force to enforce the Shah's decrees when Mossadegh inevitably refused to accept them. Officers loyal to the Shah would arrest the Prime Minister. Fourth, organise massive demonstrations supporting the Shah to make it look like popular will rather than foreign conspiracy. The British wanted to move quickly, but the Americans insisted on careful preparation. They needed to identify every loyal soldier and every potential obstacle. They created lists of people to be arrested immediately after the coup succeeded. They prepared safe houses for their agents to hide if things went wrong. They established communication codes and backup plans. Roosevelt even met secretly with the Shah's twin sister, Princess Ashraf, convincing her to pressure her brother. She flew to Tehran and told the young Shah that he must act boldly or lose everything. The Shah wavered, caught between his fear of Britain and his fear of his own people. Throughout the spring and summer of 1953, the pieces moved into position like a deadly puzzle. Money flowed to newspapers that had never criticised Mossadegh before. Suddenly, articles appeared questioning his mental stability and loyalty. Pamphlets spread through bazaars, warning that Mossadegh was planning to abolish Islam and hand Iran to atheist communists. None of this was true, but truth was not the point. The point was confusion and fear. Mossadegh knew something was happening. His intelligence services reported unusual activities and suspicious payments, but he could not prove who was behind it all, and he still believed in democratic process. He thought truth and law would protect him. He did not fully understand that he was fighting an enemy that recognized no rules, no limits, no principle higher than their own interests. The trap was being set with exquisite care, and he was walking into it one day at a time. The propaganda campaign against Mossadegh began subtly, then grew into a roar. Newspapers that had supported him for years suddenly published editorials questioning his judgment. They reprinted speeches out of context to make him seem unstable. They printed rumours as facts, suggesting he was secretly working with communists or planning to abolish private property. When readers looked for evidence, there was none, but repetition created its own reality. If every paper said something, it must be true. The editors who published these lies were not fooled. They knew exactly what they were doing. They simply cared more about the American and British money filling their pockets than about honesty. Religious leaders proved surprisingly easy to buy. The CIA's Iranian agents approached influential mullahs with bags of cash, explaining that Mossadegh was anti-Islamic and dangerous. Many refused the money and remained loyal to truth, but enough accepted to make a difference. These purchased clerics began giving sermons warning that Mossadegh would destroy Islam and bring godless communism to Iran. They said he was arrogant for challenging powerful nations. They said Iran should accept its place in the world and stop causing trouble. Their words carried weight with traditional believers who trusted religious authority. When their mullah spoke, they listened, not knowing his words were scripted by foreign intelligence services. The communist Tudeh party, which Mossadegh had banned, suddenly became visible again. Members appeared at rallies supporting Mossadegh, waving red flags and chanting slogans about workers' revolution. This was not accidental. CIA operatives had secretly paid Tudeh members to be publicly active and radical, knowing this would frighten moderate Iranians. Photographs of these communist demonstrations were circulated widely with captions suggesting Mossadegh was allied with them. The tactic worked brilliantly. Middle-class Iranians who supported nationalization began to worry. Religious conservatives grew alarmed. The Shah's supporters pointed to the photos as proof that Mossadegh was leading Iran towards Soviet control. Street violence increased mysteriously. Gangs attacked shops and government buildings, then disappeared before police arrived. Some shouted slogans praising Mossadegh. Others shouted slogans against him. The confusion was intentional. CIA reports later revealed they had hired thugs from Tehran's underworld, giving them money to create chaos without clear political identity. The goal was to make Tehran feel dangerous and unstable, to make people crave order and strong authority. Ordinary citizens stayed home, afraid to go out. Businesses closed early. The atmosphere of crisis intensified daily, exactly as the planners intended. Mossadegh and his supporters tried to fight back with truth, but truth is a weak weapon against well-funded lies. They published rebuttals and evidence of foreign interference. They arrested some paid agitators and exposed the bribes. But the propaganda machine was too large and too coordinated. For every lie they disproved, 10 new ones appeared. Mossadegh gave speeches pleading with Iranians to stay calm and not believe the manipulation. Some listened, many did not. Confusion and fear spread like a disease. The foundation of public support that had seemed so solid in 1951 was cracking. The Prime Minister could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He knew enemies were working against him. What he still did not know was how close they were to winning, or how little time remained before the final blow would fall. By mid-August 1953, Tehran felt like a city holding its breath before a storm. The propaganda had done its work, dividing the population and creating atmosphere of crisis. Now came the street demonstrations, carefully orchestrated to look spontaneous. The CIA had recruited the Rashidian brothers, wealthy Iranian businessmen with criminal connections, to organize mobs. They had money to spend and no moral qualms about how they spent it. They hired hundreds of street toughs, unemployed men, and anyone desperate enough to take payment for participating in demonstrations. Some understood they were working for foreign powers. Most did not care as long as they got paid. The mobs gathered in working-class neighborhoods and bazaars. Some chanted slogans against Mossadegh, calling him a traitor and demanding the Shah take control. Others pretended to support Mossadegh, while acting violently and threatening civilians. This created perfect confusion. When pro-Shah demonstrators marched, it looked like popular uprising. When pro-Mossadegh demonstrators caused trouble, it looked like the Prime Minister's supporters were thugs. Both types of demonstration were being funded by the same CIA accounts, creating a theatre of conflict where ordinary Iranians could not tell real from fake. The confusion served the coup plotters perfectly. On August 15, the Shah finally signed the decrees that Roosevelt had prepared months earlier. One decree dismissed Mossadegh as prime minister. Another appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi as replacement. The Shah signed with trembling hands, then immediately fled to Baghdad with his wife. He was too frightened to stay and see whether the coup would succeed or fail. If it failed, he wanted to be safely outside Iran before Mossadegh's supporters could arrest him. Colonel Nematollah Nassiri was sent to Mossadegh's house late at night to deliver the dismissal decree and arrest him. But Mossadegh had been warned by loyalist officers. When Nassiri arrived, guards arrested him instead. The first attempt at the coup had failed before it properly started. News of the failed coup spread quickly through Tehran. Mossadegh's supporters poured into streets, celebrating what looked like victory. They tore down statues of the Shah and his father. They chanted that democracy had defeated dictatorship. For one bright moment, it seemed like the people had won. Newspapers loyal to Mossadegh published stories about the foreign plot and how it had been foiled. The British and Americans watching from their embassies felt sick with worry. Had they failed? Would Mossadegh now crack down and expose all their agents? Roosevelt considered fleeing Iran immediately, but decided to wait and try one more time. What Mossadegh did not know was that failure sometimes serves conspirators better than smooth success. The chaos of August 15 to 16 gave the coup plotters perfect cover to try again with greater force. On August 17, the purchased mobs returned to the streets, but this time they were larger and better organized. They marched toward government buildings carrying photographs of the Shah. They attacked anyone who defended Mossadegh. They were joined by army units whose officers had finally been convinced through bribes and threats to support the coup. What had started as covert manipulation now became open violence. Tehran burned while the world watched, most not knowing that what looked like popular uprising was actually a carefully bought performance with tragic real consequences. The 19th of August 1953 dawned hot and tense over Tehran. The mobs returned even larger than before, this time coordinated by military officers who had finally decided to support the coup. Tanks rolled toward Mossadegh's house and the Parliament building. Pro-Shah demonstrators filled the streets by the thousands, many genuinely believing they were saving Iran from communism, not knowing they were tools of foreign intelligence. The violence escalated quickly. Gunfire echoed through neighborhoods. Buildings burned. By noon, it was clear that Mossadegh's government could not hold against this combination of military force and purchased mobs. His loyal supporters fought bravely, but were outnumbered and outgunned. Mossadegh called his cabinet together for an emergency meeting. He could hear the gunfire getting closer. His advisors begged him to order his supporters to fight back with everything they had, to call for general uprising against the coup. But Mossadegh refused to turn Tehran into a battlefield where thousands of ordinary Iranians would die. He had fought for democracy through legal means, and he would not abandon those principles even to save himself. He told his cabinet that history would judge what happened today, and he wanted history to remember that he chose the lives of citizens over his own power. It was perhaps his finest moment, though it cost him everything. By late afternoon, troops surrounded Mossadegh's house. He slipped away before they could arrest him, hiding with friends while loyal officers were rounded up and imprisoned. General Zahedi, the CIA's chosen replacement, emerged from hiding and declared himself Prime Minister. Radio stations, now controlled by the coup forces, announced that the Shah's legitimate decree had been enforced and order restored. Zahedi praised the Shah and promised stability. He made no mention of British or American involvement. The story being told to the world was that Iranians themselves had rejected Mossadegh's government and welcomed the Shah's return. The Shah flew back to Tehran on August 22, 3 days after the coup succeeded. Crowds lined the streets to cheer him, though many in those crowds had been paid to be there. The young Shah believed he had won a great victory, that his people truly loved him and rejected Mossadegh's nationalism. He did not understand that he had just become a puppet who thought himself a king. British and American officials celebrated quietly. The oil would flow again under terms favourable to them. The precedent of nationalisation had been crushed. Other countries watching would learn the lesson, challenge Western interests, and face destruction. The costs of those 3 days were counted in the weeks that followed. Nearly 300 Iranians died in the violence. Thousands were arrested, many tortured in prisons. Mossadegh eventually surrendered to prevent more bloodshed. He was tried for treason in a court that was pure theatre, sentenced to 3 years in prison, then kept under house arrest for the rest of his life. He lived until 1967, a broken old man who watched his country return to foreign control. Democracy in Iran died with him in those 3 August days. What replaced it was a dictatorship backed by Western powers, ruling through fear and secret police. The wound inflicted in 1953 never healed. It festered, becoming infected with resentment that would explode 26 years later in a revolution that stunned the world. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi returned to power, believing he had earned his throne through courage and popular support. He did not see, or chose not to see, the invisible hands that had lifted him back. The British and Americans let him believe the fiction. They needed him confident and grateful, not ashamed or resentful. Within months, new oil agreements were signed. The nationalisation was technically maintained as face-saving gesture, but control returned to foreign companies through a complex arrangement. A consortium of British, American, and other Western oil companies would operate Iran's oil fields for 25 years. Iran would receive 50% of profits, much better than before, but still allowing foreigners to control production and pricing. Mossadegh had fought for true independence. The Shah settled for a better cage. The Americans particularly benefited from the new arrangement. Before 1953, British companies had monopolized Iranian oil. Now American companies received 40% of the consortium's shares. This was their reward for engineering the coup. Oil that had once flowed entirely to Britain now fed American industry as well. The coup had been sold to Eisenhower as preventing communist takeover, but the real result was transferring control from one democratic government to Western corporations. Nobody in Washington or London admitted this openly. They congratulated themselves on saving Iran from chaos, while Iranian Democrats rotted in prison cells. The Shah built his dictatorship systematically with American support and guidance. In 1957, with CIA help, he established SAVAK, a secret police force that would become notorious for torture and disappearances. SAVAK agents were trained by CIA and Israeli intelligence. They learned techniques for extracting confessions and breaking spirits. Anyone suspected of opposing the Shah could be arrested without charges and held indefinitely. University students who protested disappeared into prisons. Writers who criticized the government were silenced. Even moderate politicians learned to keep quiet or face consequences. The Shah claimed he was modernizing Iran and fighting communism. In reality, he was building a police state to protect his power and foreign interests. Iran's oil wealth increased dramatically through the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds. The Shah spent billions on military equipment, mostly purchased from the United States. He built a modern army with advanced weapons, jets, and tanks. He launched development projects, building roads and dams. He promoted women's rights and education. These reforms were real and beneficial, but they were imposed from above by decree, not chosen through democratic process. And the wealth remained concentrated among the Shah's supporters while many Iranians stayed poor. The gap between the westernized elite in Tehran and traditional society in smaller cities and villages grew wider every year. It was a modernization without roots, glittering on the surface but hollow beneath. American presidents visited Tehran and praised the Shah as a progressive ally. Nixon called Iran an island of stability. The Shah believed his own propaganda, thinking his people loved him because nobody dared say otherwise. Savak made sure dissent stayed invisible. But you cannot suppress anger forever. You can only drive it underground where it festers and grows stronger. In mosques and universities, in tea houses and homes, Iranians whispered about the coup and Mossadegh's betrayal. They remembered that democracy had been possible until foreigners destroyed it. They watched the Shah grow more arrogant and isolated, and they waited. The chessboard looked stable to Western eyes, but beneath the surface, pieces were moving toward a game nobody saw coming until it was too late to stop. The pipelines pumped steadily through the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, carrying Iran's black gold to refineries and tankers bound for Western ports. Production increased year by year as new wells were drilled and technology improved. Iran became one of the world's largest oil exporters, and money flowed into the treasury in unprecedented amounts. The Shah spent this wealth on grand projects meant to transform Iran into a modern power. He built universities and hospitals. He constructed the Tehran metro. He created a steel industry and nuclear power program. On paper, Iran was developing rapidly, but something essential was missing beneath all the construction and progress. The oil wealth never reached most Iranians in meaningful ways. Yes, there were more schools and roads, but the gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. The Shah's family and their cronies lived in unimaginable luxury. They built mansions and threw parties that cost more than entire villages earned in years. They sent their children to European and American schools. They vacationed on the French Riviera. Meanwhile, rural Iranians still struggled to feed their families. Workers in factories earned wages that barely covered rent. The modernization the Shah boasted about benefited primarily the urban elite, who spoke French and wore Western clothes. For traditional Iranians, the changes felt like alien imposition. The bazaar merchants, who had once supported Mossadegh's nationalism, found themselves squeezed by the Shah's economic policies. He favored big corporations over small businesses. He gave contracts to foreign companies instead of local entrepreneurs. The bazaarists, as the merchant class was called, resented this deeply. They formed an alliance with religious conservatives who hated the Shah's westernization program. In mosques, mullahs preached that Iran had lost its soul, selling its resources to infidels while abandoning Islamic values. These religious criticisms found eager audiences among people who felt left behind by modernization and nostalgic for traditions that seemed to be disappearing. One mullah stood out from the rest. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was elderly, stern, and absolutely uncompromising. He gave sermons denouncing the Shah as an American puppet who had betrayed Islam and sold Iran to foreigners. He spoke about the 1953 coup as the original sin that corrupted everything. He reminded people that Mossadegh had been overthrown for wanting Iranian control of Iranian oil. In 1963, Khomeini was arrested for his speeches and eventually exiled. But exile only amplified his voice. His recorded sermons were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes. People listened in secret, his words confirming what many felt but feared to say. The Shah's government was illegitimate, built on foreign intervention and maintained by torture. Through all this, American support for the Shah never wavered. Washington saw only a friendly government that sold oil at reasonable prices and opposed communism. They did not see or did not care about Savak's torture chambers or the growing resentment among ordinary Iranians. When human rights organizations reported abuses, American officials made excuses. Iran was strategically important. The Shah was pro-Western. That was all that mattered in Cold War calculations. Nobody in Washington imagined that this alliance built on oil and repression was creating the conditions for an explosion. They thought they had won permanently in 1953. They did not understand that you cannot cheat a nation out of democracy and expect gratitude. The oil kept flowing west, and with it flowed Iranian rage that was not being spent, only accumulated, waiting for the moment when it would finally be released. The 1,970 seconds brought Iran to a peak of apparent prosperity and hidden crisis. Oil prices quadrupled after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, flooding Iran's treasury with unprecedented wealth. The Shah announced a white revolution of reforms meant to modernize society. Women gained voting rights. Land reforms reduced the power of large landowners. Literacy programs expanded education. These changes were genuine improvements for many Iranians, but they were also destabilizing, disrupting traditional patterns without replacing them with something that felt authentic or earned. Change imposed from above by decree always creates resentment among those who feel their values and way of life being erased. The Shah grew increasingly megalomaniacal as oil wealth and American praise inflated his ego beyond reason. In 1971, he threw a party at Persepolis to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, spending over $100 million on the event. Foreign dignitaries were flown in, served by Paris caterers in tents designed to look like ancient Persian pavilions. Champagne and caviar flowed, while most Iranians had never tasted either. The extravagance stunned even the Shah's supporters. Religious conservatives saw it as blasphemous waste. Critics noted the irony of celebrating Persian glory at the ruins of an empire that had fallen because it grew too arrogant and lost touch with its people. The Shah heard none of these criticisms. Savak kept dissent invisible to him. By the mid-1970 seconds, even the American embassy in Tehran was sending worried cables to Washington. Reports documented increasing repression, torture, and public discontent. But these warnings were ignored or minimized by officials who still saw the Shah as irreplaceable. American investment in Iran had grown massive. Tens of thousands of American workers lived in Iran, operating military equipment and oil facilities. The relationship seemed too important to risk by pushing the Shah toward reform or democracy. Besides, what was the alternative? Better a friendly dictator than risk another Mossadegh who might nationalize industries or turn toward the Soviet Union. The revolution began almost invisibly in 1977 and 1978. Small protests about economic issues turned into larger demonstrations demanding political freedom. The Shah's forces shot protesters, creating martyrs. Traditional Islamic mourning rituals held 40 days after deaths created natural occasions for more protests, which created more martyrs, which created more mourning gatherings that became protests. The cycle accelerated beyond Savak's ability to suppress. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Oil workers stopped production. The treasury that had seemed bottomless suddenly ran dry. The Shah, who had seemed invincible, suddenly looked weak and confused. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran for the last time, officially on vacation, but really in permanent exile. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from 14 years of exile to crowds of millions. The revolution had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. The government Khomeini established was not the democracy Mossadegh had fought for. It was a religious theocracy that would prove brutal in its own ways. But it was fiercely independent and hostile to the West, particularly America. The hostage crisis later that year, where revolutionary students seized the American embassy and held diplomats for 444 days, was direct revenge for 1,953. They found CIA documents proving American involvement in the coup and published them for the world to see. The chessboard had been flipped completely. The game Western powers thought they had won in 1953 turned out to be just one move in a much longer match they were now losing. The 1953 coup in Iran was not an isolated event. It was a blueprint that would be copied across the globe throughout the Cold War. The success of Operation Ajax convinced American planners that covert action was cheaper and more deniable than military intervention. If you could topple a government with a few $1 million and some clever manipulation, why risk American lives in open warfare? The CIA learned from Iran and refined its techniques. Within a year, they applied these lessons in Guatemala, overthrowing democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz because he threatened United Fruit Company's interests with land reform. The pattern was set. When governments challenged American corporate interests, they could be removed. The Congo followed. When Patrice Lumumba became prime minister and tried to nationalize Belgian mining operations, he was marked for removal. The CIA supported his assassination in 1961, helping install a brutal dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled for decades while Western companies extracted billions in minerals. Chile came next. Salvador Allende's democratic election in 1970 alarmed Nixon and Kissinger. They orchestrated economic warfare and supported a military coup in 1973 that killed Allende and installed Augusto Pinochet's vicious dictatorship. Each time, the justification was fighting communism. Each time, the real motivation involved protecting corporate profits and geopolitical control. What made these interventions especially tragic was that they often targeted democratic governments. Arbenz had been elected fairly. Allende won through legitimate democratic process. Mossadegh had parliamentary support. These were not dictators threatening their people. They were leaders trying to assert sovereignty over national resources and improve their people's lives. But sovereignty was only acceptable when it aligned with American interests. When countries tried genuine independence, they discovered that democracy only mattered to Washington when it produced the right results. The pattern repeated so often, it became boring routine for intelligence agencies. Identify a problematic leader. Fund opposition groups. Manipulate media coverage. Create economic chaos. Support military officers willing to coup. Then install a friendly government and forget about what happens to the people. Nobody in CIA headquarters lost sleep over torture chambers in Chile or disappeared activists in Guatemala. These were acceptable costs of maintaining American hegemony. The people suffering were far away, and their stories did not reach American newspapers that preferred to describe friendly dictators as imperfect but necessary allies. Middle Eastern countries watched what happened in Iran and drew conclusions. They saw that nationalizing resources led to destruction. They learned to negotiate carefully, never pushing too hard, always leaving Western companies satisfied. The few who tried to follow Mossadegh's example faced similar fates, but they also learned to resent deeply and permanently. Every country that had been coup target, every society that had watched democracy crushed for oil or minerals, remembered. The resentment built into a reservoir of anti-Western feeling that would eventually overflow in various forms: terrorism, religious extremism, political instability. The coup in Iran specifically contributed to the rise of political Islam as alternative to both Western capitalism and Soviet communism. When democracy and nationalism failed, people turned to religion as the only force that seemed beyond foreign manipulation. The consequences of 1953 echo still through our present day. For decades after 1953, the American and British governments denied any involvement in Mossadegh's overthrow. When Iranian activists accused the CIA of engineering the coup, Western media dismissed them as conspiracy theorists. Official history portrayed the events as internal Iranian politics, a conflict between the Shah and an unstable prime minister that resolved itself through popular will. This lie was maintained through classified documents and official secrecy laws, but secrets do not stay buried forever. Eventually, time and pressure open even the most carefully locked doors. The first cracks appeared in the 1970 seconds when journalists began investigating CIA activities. Investigative reporters published books suggesting American involvement in various coups. The Church Committee hearings in the Senate exposed some CIA operations, but Iran remained officially denied. Then in 2000, the New York Times published a leaked internal CIA history of Operation Ajax. The document, written in the 1970 seconds, described in detail how Kermit Roosevelt and his team had planned and executed the coup. It named names, cited dollar amounts, explained techniques. The CIA could no longer deny what was now documented in their own words. In 2013, the CIA officially acknowledged its role for the first time. An official statement admitted that the agency had orchestrated the coup along with British intelligence. The statement said the overthrow of Mossadegh was carried out under CIA direction as an act of US foreign policy. The admission came 60 years late, long after most participants were dead and consequences were irreversible. The British government never fully acknowledged their role, maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid direct admissions. But the documents made their involvement undeniable to anyone who looked at the evidence. For Iranians, especially older ones who had lived through the era, the admissions brought vindication but not healing. They had known the truth all along, had shouted it to anyone who would listen. Now the world confirmed what they had always said. Their democracy had been stolen by foreign powers protecting oil interests. But knowing you were right does not undo 60 years of consequences. It does not bring back the tortured and disappeared. It does not restore the democratic traditions that were crushed. It does not erase the trauma that shaped subsequent generations. American officials offered no real apology, only acknowledgement of facts. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright gave a speech in 2000 admitting that the coup was a setback for Iran's political development and that America bore responsibility. But she offered no compensation, no accountability for individuals involved, no substantive change in policy toward Iran. The admission was meant to improve relations, to turn a new page. But you cannot turn a page when the consequences of past actions continue shaping the present. Iran's government remained hostile to America, partly because of 1953, and partly because admitting wrongdoing without offering meaningful redress felt like adding insult to injury. The archive opened, the secrets spilled out. But the wounds remained fresh because nobody had seriously tried to heal them. The story of the Tehran chessboard carries lessons that echo through our time. The first and most obvious is that short-term success in foreign policy often creates long-term disaster. Britain and America won in 1953. They got their oil access and removed a troublesome nationalist, but they created a generation of Iranians who learned to distrust democracy because Western powers destroyed it when it threatened their interests. They planted seeds of anti-Western resentment that grew into the 1979 revolution and continue shaping Middle Eastern politics today. The momentary victory cost decades of hostility and instability. The second lesson involves respecting sovereignty and democracy. When Western powers talk about promoting freedom and self-determination, the world listens skeptically because of cases like Iran. How can America claim to support democracy while overthrowing elected governments that make inconvenient choices? The hypocrisy is visible to everyone except those committing it. This gap between proclaimed values and actual behaviour undermines every genuine attempt at building trust. Mossadegh was imperfect and made mistakes, but he represented his people's will. Respecting that will, even when it conflicted with oil interests, would have served everyone better in the long run than crushing it and installing a dictator. The third lesson concerns the true costs of cheap oil. When we fill our gas tanks, we rarely think about the history behind that fuel. But oil has never been just a commodity. It is soaked in blood and political manipulation. The cheap energy that powered Western prosperity in the 20th century came partly from exploiting countries like Iran, extracting their resources while returning minimal benefits. We are still paying the costs of this exploitation in instability, terrorism, and broken trust between regions. True energy security would mean fair relationships and sustainable practices, not domination and extraction. The fourth lesson is about memory and consequences. Nations remember what is done to them. Iran remembers 1953 as clearly as America remembers Pearl Harbor or 9/11. That memory shapes current Iranian behavior, making negotiations difficult and trust impossible. American policymakers who wonder why Iran remains hostile often forget or never learned the history of American intervention there. They treat Iranian suspicion as irrational when it is actually quite rational given the past. You cannot heal relationships without acknowledging wounds. The delayed admission of involvement helped somewhat, but admissions without accountability or changed behavior are hollow. And finally, the lesson about cycles of violence and intervention. The coup in Iran became a model for interventions across the globe. Each intervention created its own resentments and consequences. The collective weight of these actions helped create the world we inhabit now, where anti-Western sentiment runs deep in many regions, and where terrorism finds fertile ground in anger over historical grievances. Breaking these cycles requires different choices. Respecting sovereignty even when it is inconvenient. Supporting democracy even when it produces leaders we dislike. And acknowledging that some things, including justice and long-term peace, matter more than short-term interests. The chessboard is still there, peace is still moving, but perhaps future players will choose different moves, having learnt from the disasters that come from treating nations as pawns rather than partners. Take a deep breath now. Let the weight of this story settle gently in your thoughts. You have travelled through time tonight, witnessing how oil and empires and secret plans changed the course of history. The lessons are heavy, but they are important. If this journey has moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might learn from it. Share this video with a friend who loves history or someone curious about why the Middle East carries so much complexity. Leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most or what lesson resonates with your own understanding of the world. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that dig beneath the surface of history to find the human truth underneath. And remember, understanding the past helps us build a better future. The chessboard is still there, but we can choose to play differently. Rest well tonight, carrying these stories with you into tomorrow. So the story of Tehran's chessboard comes to rest. Oil beneath the sand brought both wealth and wounds. Empires played their games, while ordinary people paid the costs. Democracy bloomed briefly, then was crushed by those who feared what it might become. The consequences ripple still through our present world, reminding us that history is never truly past. It lives in every choice we make and every relationship between nations. Perhaps the greatest lesson is simple. Treat others as you wish to be treated, even when you have the power to do otherwise. Respect sovereignty. Honor democracy. Remember that what we do to others eventually returns to us in ways we cannot predict. Sleep now, dreaming of a world where power serves justice instead of profit, where nations speak truth instead of propaganda, where the resources beneath the earth belong to those who live above it. Sweet dreams, and may tomorrow bring wisdom that yesterday lacked.